Good morning guys and welcome to this new video. Today we are going to cover the topic of Maria Montessori, who was a bit of an emblem of pedagogy in Italy throughout the course of the 20th century. In fact, she was a very great educator, pedagogue, physician and child neuropsychiatrist, as well as a very great scientist. Maria Montessori was born in 1870 in Chiaravalle in the province of Ancona, and she demonstrated from an early age her propensity for study and her skill with regard to school. Her point of reference in the family was her uncle Antonio Stoppani, who was an abbot and spent his entire life proving that science and faith coexisted perfectly. Montessori took technical studies in school, and this did not allow her to enroll in medical school at the university, because at the time only those who had done classical high school could enter medical school. So at first she enrolled in science school, even arguing with her father, as her father wanted her to be a teacher, and instead she already wanted to be a doctor. After 2 years she was able to move on to medical school, and shortly graduated brilliantly. In fact, Maria Montessori was one of the first women to graduate from medical school in Italy and specialize in child neuropsychiatry. She became world famous for the method she invented because, let's say, she was really passionate about children, and for 50 years she did nothing but observe and work with children. Her path began precisely by following children with mental distress and learning difficulties that she followed in the poorest neighborhoods of Rome. What he observed throughout these early years of his career was that children with these hardships learned much more easily through hands-on experience. They could not memorize and really understand things if they were explained verbally, but instead by experiencing them with objects and then having practical experience of the world around them, they were able to understand them much better. So he founded a method that started with these children, but which he then applied to all other children as well. In 1907, in the San Lorenzo district, he opened the first children's home, which was later followed by many others that opened not only in Italy but also in the rest of the world. There her fame spread throughout the world. Even in America, during a congress in 1913, she was given the title of Most Interesting Woman in Europe for her modern methods. Another very important date was in 1926, because Montessori organized the first training course for teachers to teach precisely her method, and she had become so famous that the success of this course was resounding. Just think that as many as 180 teachers from all over Italy traveled to participate in Montessori's course. However, during the fascist era, her schools were closed because they were considered too revolutionary, and so she was also forced to flee Italy and traveled almost all over the world making her method known. So as I was telling you before, Montessori spent more than 50 years of her life observing children all over the world, and observed them in their totality in 360 degrees. So not only on the sense-motor level, but also on the cognitive level, so the development of thought, and on the affective relational level. Her method was born first from observation and then from experimentation, and thus she was the first Italian pedagogist to found a method based precisely on scientific pedagogy. In fact, Montessori started from the assumption that every child has infinite and above all unique potential. The task of the adult then is what? It is to help bring out these talents, these potentialities, these propensities, and these aptitudes that are precisely unique, respecting what are his needs for knowledge and exploration of external reality. In practice, then, this method is based on the natural development of the child by helping him to grow, cultivating what are his spontaneous propensities in knowing and being interested in the outside world. The Montessori method is considered truly revolutionary for this very reason, because in the learning process it places the needs and interests of the individual child at the center. Now let us proceed in stages and see what the fundamental variables are in the Montessori method. The fundamental variables are mainly three: the environment, the materials that are used during the lessons, and the role of the teacher. Let's start with the environment. Montessori classrooms are studied in every minute detail. Nothing is left to chance. Everything is scientifically studied in its own detail. The whole environment is studied precisely in function of the child's learning, of facilitating a spontaneous and free learning of the child, of facilitating also the movements within this environment of this space for the child, who thus feels very comfortable, and by experiencing everything that he will later find and that I will explain to you, he will then be able to get to know the outside reality. These schools were called precisely the children's home because they were supposed to remind one of a familiar environment. That is, the child was not supposed to feel the separation between home and school. He was supposed to feel a little bit like home. The classroom, as I told you before, was carefully organized by the teacher, both from a physical point of view and therefore organization of space, and from a conceptual point of view, i.e., in terms of the progressive use of materials, and above all, it was ordered in such a way as to allow the absorbing mind of the child to introject precisely the concept of order and cleanliness. The environment was an hospitable, bright environment with light colors that were conducive precisely to the child's own well-being within the classroom. The environment is also organized by the teacher in such a way as to leave the pupil free to be able to choose the materials that will be made available, to be able to move around quietly, and also to be able to move objects very easily within the classroom itself according to the activity that he or she alone decides to do. So now let's look at the materials. Let's say that meanwhile the furniture is very light and very low, that is, at child height. The chairs and tables will also be very small precisely so that the children can sit comfortably, get to the tables comfortably, be able to move these materials around as needed if they need space to experiment with other games, and the shelving is low and shallow so that the children can pick up all the objects that will be displayed on the shelves by themselves. The materials in the children's home are practical life materials, sensory materials, and cultural materials. The practical life materials are the materials for both personal care and household care, and thus materials, for example, to clean up after an activity such as a broom for sweeping, something for washing and hanging out, something for cooking, cutting, sewing, and so on. Then a series of sensory materials related precisely to the development of the senses, and then auditory, visual, gustatory, tactile, thermal, baric, and so on. And then a series of cultural materials so related to geography, math, science, botany, and so on. Before we look at the role of the teacher, let us see how a typical lesson is conducted in one of the Montessori classrooms. According to precisely this method, children are free to be able to act and move in space, and they will find different materials available each time, which will be prepared first by the teacher. They will be free to take them and then be able to experiment with them until they understand them, and then they can play with them, they can study them until really then they are bored because they have understood how they work, and they have to put them back then where they found them in place, just because of the concept of order that we were talking about earlier. The lesson will take place in two moments, mainly one of experimentation and the other of observation, because the materials will not be for the number of all the pupils. For example, there will be a globe, there will be a book, and there will be other tools. Each child is free to take an instrument, and another child who is curious about the same instrument can observe his or her companion while he or she is experimenting with it. So probably the companion who first picks up the instrument or game will take a little longer to understand how it works. The other, who will have observed it by the time he or she then picks it up, will take much less time, because having already observed his or her companion, he or she will have already understood how that instrument works. The lesson is divided into these two moments, experimentation and observation. As I was telling you, even though there is this maximum freedom of the child in being able to handle and make use of all the tools that the teacher makes available to him, all meticulously prepared by the teacher. So now we come right to the role of the teacher. The role of the teacher is really important in that meticulously before the lesson, he or she carefully prepares the whole environment, keeps it tidy, clean, will make available the objects that he or she deems important for that type of lesson, which then the children on their own can experience precisely by taking them and observing them. So we say there is a whole preparation for the child's self-educational activity. Then she will somehow initiate the children to the use of these tools. She will respect her free choices within the organized context. Therefore, without imposing the use of one material over another, she will respect the times and rhythms of each individual child. Therefore, she will not go to interfere with the time it takes a child to experience one object or another. Her role will be an observer role, seemingly a passive role, but in fact she will not so physically put herself in the center of the room. She will stand to one side, one corner, and observe the whole situation. And so she will observe how the child interacts with the tools and how they interact in the environment with their peers. His direct intervention will be limited only to exceptional cases. For example, when two children start to fight heavily and perhaps come to blows, and he will intervene to separate them. And this non-intervention on the part of the teacher is very important, precisely because according to the Montessori method, the child has to experiment in his own time and learn about the world around him on his own. Another key thing with respect to non-intervention by the teacher is that most of the materials that Montessori uses are self-correcting and therefore contain in themselves self-correction to error the moment the child makes a mistake. However, the Montessori method also goes beyond the organized classroom, as I was explaining to you so much, so that even the whole perimeter outside the school becomes fundamental to the knowledge of the children. In that for her, the psychomotor activity, the theater activity, is also fundamental. So for example, even getting outside spaces such as a garden, a vegetable garden, and so on. This is a method that, as I told you before, is then used not only in Italy, but expands a little bit all over the world. And still today, there are many schools, especially for young children, that use the Montessori method. Think about the fact that this woman also had a rather rocambolic life, because during the outbreak of Second World War, she was with her son in India, and because it was not part of her territory, she was interned and only managed to return to Italy in the last phase of her life. She is a pedagogist who certainly left a great mark, a great pride for Italy, not only as a woman, but also as a woman who pioneered a real revolution for the school. Well, guys, with this, I have concluded my talk on Montessori. I hope I have been clear if there are still doubts. You can, as usual, leave me questions below. I salute you and see you at the next lesson. Thank you.